We are live. This is the market update. Welcome to Dip Day. Magnificent 7 stocks report earnings. Can't wait to see how they're going to justify their levitated values. Grab your popcorn. Is Jerome Powell in trouble? There has never in my mind been more drama about what a Fed guy is going to do and say. This has to be constructive crypto. It just has to be. And I think every time you get these down days, you must take advantage. You must take advantage. Because if Powell is done, let's review what happens. First thing that happens is the new guy comes in and probably provides some level of transparency as to what the Fed actually does, which is probably buy S&P futures all day long to levitate the market. 1. 2, they may not have the gold that they say they have because the U.S. government didn't have the Bitcoin that they said they have. That story seemed to get sort of brushed under the rug. Any new Fed chairman is going to immediately start putting high-powered money into the system, more so than is happening right now. I think Powell's got high-powered money in the system in order to save his job, which accounts for the massive altcoin rally, along with the fact that there was some rotation out of Bitcoin, although I really don't think players out there sold Bitcoin to buy SUI. Just an example. I think, high-powered money went into the system, and crypto woke up. Now, speaking of crypto waking up, let's talk about the Ethereum and Solana comedy show. So first, Ethereum was going to zero. I don't know if you remember that. So first it was going to zero. Then it was going nowhere. Then it exploded to 3,800. Then, interestingly, JP Morgan starts offering loans against Ethereum. Ethereum is disappearing off exchanges. Cathie Wood is buying Ethereum treasury stocks. And all of a sudden, the entire world, especially after a dollar down move, has discovered that Ethereum at like a $450 billion market cap is absurdly cheap, somewhat scarce, and definitively functional. Tom Lee, who used to work at Fundstrat, has now gone to work for an Ethereum treasury company to go on TV talk shows to talk about how ETH is going to 15K next year. Well, there's nothing wrong with 15K. After all, ETH should be in the conversation with Magnificent 7 stocks that are all worth anywhere from 1 to 4 trillion. Solana has also awakened, as everyone figures out that Solana at $100 billion market cap is an epic, laughable joke, which is why with the market down today, Solana is still up. Not to mention the fact that, a trivial aside, Bonk.Fun is replacing Pump.Fun to where the Pump.Fun token crashed. Little guy innovates, big guy wins. Back to Solana. I don't think people understand Solana as a pathway for DeFi, DePIN, and stablecoins. I think it's just known as this meme coin platform, which is absurd. In other words, my understanding is recently Solana flipped BNB, Binance Coin. Now, there's nothing wrong with BNB. It's a way to trade in their casino, but I don't think BNB is the future of stablecoins and DePIN. And with Solana in that conversation with BNB, I have to think that as soon as this market turns around, Solana could go parabolic, like literally. You had a massive move in Ethereum. You could also have a massive move in Solana, like massive. Like, Solana at like 300 and making a new high. I mean, everything basically made a new high. Why would Solana not do that? And of course, there's the whole Solana universe that comes with it, right? There's, Bonk, all the big memes. Okay, Jupiter, Radium, and you could just go on down the list. There's also the idea of the Solana and the Ethereum ETFs, which is going to act as a floor underneath the market. Because as everybody is looking at red ink this morning and undoubtedly going, right, even if you FOMO'd in yesterday, if you get these red days, particularly if they're nasty, you got to take advantage. I think you get these 4 or 5% dips. Yeah, I mean, there are 4 or 5% dips in most altcoins, but Bitcoin is up. Ethereum's going nowhere. Solana is up. XRP is going nowhere. There isn't going to be any dips in any of these institutional or ETF or futures contract coins. Not without some sort of geopolitical event. To be honest with you, the only risk to crypto that I can see that would be tangible is some sort of next flare-up in the Middle East. Right? In other words, if there's an oil price spike or something like that. Between now and then, especially with Magnificent 7 earnings coming out, right? In other words, it's so easy for the stock market to just moon everything, but then they have their reality check and that they have to say, all right, let's look at the stock versus what they said they were going to earn. So there's the stock price, there's what they said they were going to earn, and then there's what they actually report. Okay. Most of the time, all these tech companies figure out how to report better than expected earnings. Most of the time. I think everyone's going to take a look at Web3 and they're going to hear things like, we're going to spend indiscriminate amounts of money on data centers. There was an article today about liquid cooling, which I would assume means huge demand for water because they can't keep these data centers cool because there isn't enough electricity. Right? So you're going to hear all about the data center build-outs, and you have to ask yourself, what exactly does that mean for decentralized AI in crypto? And then, of course, there's our administration. Here they are. The White House will release its first crypto policy report to the public before the end of the month. Okay, last I heard, the White House crypto policy is to moon world liberty's bags. Jokes aside, notice how Crypto Week is going beyond Crypto Week because they've released multiple distractions, everything from the Washington, D.C. American football team to releasing the files from a deceased leader in the 60s. And nothing works as good as crypto. Nothing works as good as crypto. As a matter of fact, I understand this scandal that they're trying to get away from is resulting in Congress getting shut down early for the summer because they don't want to have a vote related to whatever this scandal is. Because multiple, I don't know, let's call them intelligence services could be involved, blah, 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 blah. Okay, it's a scandal that's not going away. So they have to continually pivot towards crypto. The saying in legacy is that they have to talk up the market. In other words, they have to be on the tape on a regular basis, saying something positive about crypto, maybe talking about the Clarity Act, talking about like executive orders or crypto policy. I mean, you would think this would mean the sovereign wealth fund. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but there was the talk of the Bitcoin strategic reserve, which never happened. It would be a good idea if they tried that. But if they can't do that, they're making billions upon billions with these tariffs. I mean, General Motors earnings took a huge hit because of an increase in auto parts prices. So I don't know what the orange man is doing with all these billions upon billions of dollars that they're making on these tariffs. Well, I mean, they should be going into the sovereign wealth fund. They should be. So hopefully this crypto announcement that they're doing, honestly, is that they're going to start buying crypto. I mean, again, they have all these untold billions, and I don't know if that's being sent to the Fed to support our debt. But if they're announcing a crypto policy, a sovereign wealth fund makes sense. If you're wondering what a sovereign wealth fund is, it's just essentially a giant hedge fund run by a sovereign. Like the Norwegians have one for their natural gas money. I think the Saudis and all the big Middle Eastern countries have got them. You know, these are huge, huge, huge players. If the United States wants to get involved in this game, they should announce it quickly. While Bitcoin is still cheap, and ta-da, Solana takes out 200 billion market cap. Yay. Federal Housing Director Plute says Jerome Powell's Federal Reserve Housing Director says Powell's resignation speech is coming soon. I love how everybody is trying to like call the Fed chairman's exit. You know, Polymarket has a 20% chance of Powell leaving. Now, let's maybe talk a little bit more about that. Obviously, Powell leaving would be massively bullish for crypto because, again, the next guy that comes in, the first thing he does is spins up the printer massively, right? In other words, you know, the absolute level of rates is irrelevant. The amount of money that goes into the system, the legacy people call it expanding the balance sheet. In other words, the Fed comes in, prints money, and buys securities and puts those securities on their balance sheet. The more money they print, the more assets they put on their balance sheet. When they were tightening, they were doing the opposite. They weren't printing money, and they were letting the bonds on their books just expire, meaning, you know, the Treasury would have to pay them back, and that's it. They wouldn't buy any new securities. So if Powell leaves, he knows what happens. Now, will he leave knowing that's what happens? I mean, as I talk that out, if I was him, I wouldn't leave. I would make the orange man fire me. Like, you know, please fire me. You know, in the meantime, he's becoming an actual celebrity. Seriously. I mean, when a Fed chairman leaves, I mean, most likely he would go back to his alma mater, Princeton, and become a professor. That's what most of these guys do, or they join think tanks. They're going to turn Powell into a social media star by platforming him, by talking about him constantly. And all these, like, you know, congressmen and all these, you know, housing chairman, like everyone's betting. Everyone's like, well, Powell's going to quit any minute. Okay, well, if I was Powell, I wouldn't. I would just make him fire me, right? Because again, they're literally making him famous. Really. Plus, I think Powell is doing exactly what he has to do to save the Fed. Now, here is Besant. I called for a review of the Federal Reserve. It's my belief that the central bank should conduct an exhaustive internal review of its non-monetary policy operations, which is a nice way of saying buying S&P futures. Significant mission creep and institutional growth have taken the Fed into areas that potentially jeopardize the independence of its core monetary policy mission. As I have said many times, the Fed conducts monetary policy. It's like a jewel box that should be walled off to pressure to preserve its independence. Okay, and he goes on and on. Basically, the Fed's job is to keep Wall Street moving, to keep Wall Street making tons of money. I mean, the classic example, which is the biggest reason to buy crypto ever, is the reason rates are high is because banks can deposit money at the Fed, and the Fed has to pay them interest to the point where the Fed is like actually losing money doing so. They're paying out bank welfare, and you've heard me talk about this. Like, what does the Fed actually do? And why do they need a $2.5 billion building? Is it to keep them in or us out? I think it's to keep us out. It's a giant soundproof intelligence headquarters as far as I could see. Do you realize that when the Fed makes policy decisions, they do it in this like ultra secure, zero sound, zero cell phone, zero signal, like sub basement where nobody can hear what they have to say, which is funny because I think every single Wall Street bank knows what they're going to do before they do it. But it's a super secretive organization. In other words, their independence or alleged independence has allowed them to be shrouded in secrecy because, nobody really dares question what they do because they keep Wall Street going. Now, people are looking at what's going on and they're like, okay, well, if inflation is at 3% and rates are at 4%, that's really not a terrible thing. I don't think as a Fed chairman, you're doing a terrible job if that's what your interest rate and inflation picture looks like. But you have to ask yourself, what else is going on? Now, if you knew even half of that, you would just indiscriminately buy crypto. Indiscriminately buy crypto. Matter of fact, it's already started. Like, look at this. So you've got Tom Lee, who, is an analyst. I can tell you stories about Tom Lee. So he went from working in research to now he's working with an ETH treasury company. And Cathie Wood is buying the ETH treasury company. So nobody wanted Ethereum at 1,400, although I think she was buying ETH at 1,400. Nobody wanted Ethereum at 1,400, but at 3,800, it's much more attractive because Tom Lee thinks it's going to 15,000. Now, Tom Lee is very, very, very used to going on TV and talking about crazy upside targets. The guy literally made his name in the 2017, 2018 bear market when in 2018, Bitcoin would just cascade lower. I mean, it went from like 20 to 12 and then bounced up to 14 and then went down to 6, sat there, and then for like 2 months, and then fell off a cliff and went to 3,000. And during this entire avalanche lower, particularly at the end, Tom Lee's upside target for Bitcoin by the end of the year was like, 13,000. And they would bring him on every single day, every single week, every single talk show, every time Bitcoin would go down. And they would be like, Tom, are you adjusting your Bitcoin price target for the end of the year? And he was like, no. And of course, he would be ridiculed and made fun of and, whatever. But he was famous. He was on TV every day for being wrong. Meanwhile, Bitcoin then turns around, builds a base around 3K, and then you just woke up one day and it was at 13. That was in 2019. It just went from 3 to 13 on a line. It very much reminds me of what just happened in ETH, right? Just straight up. Now, of course, that was 6 months too late for Tom Lee, but he was already famous. He was already a famous guy, and he was vindicated. Now somebody figured out, well, let's take this famous guy and have him pumping our ETH bag to the point where, he's on like altcoin daily thumbnails, making a funny face going, this guy will change your life. So, again, nobody wanted ETH at the 2017 high at 1400. But people are definitely interested in ETH at 3,800 because after all, like we could I could pull up the ETH charts and go through this because I've done that. Basically, ETH is where it was, kind of back where it was in 2022. Like ETH hasn't done anything really in 3 years, really. And with all the fanfare that you've got in all these other cryptos, I mean, this ETH freight train is not over, which is a good segue into a red day in crypto. If you get a red day in crypto and you eventually get positive Magnificent Seven earnings, like what happens if all these characters who are bearish in equities get squeezed out? Maybe, cup of Kool-Aid for everyone, maybe. What happens if everyone realizes that crypto is the cheapest risk asset out there and the Cathie Woods of the world start looking at ETH compared to Magnificent Seven stocks? I talk about this all the time. ETH is cheap, or, Solana is cheap, and you need to start looking at them in terms of market cap. Do you realize that if you have even a modest uptick in Magnificent Seven stocks, pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds are all going to be looking at Ethereum, Solana. They have ETFs, they have futures contracts, and they're going to be like, oh my God, we have to buy this stuff. It is just so cheap relative to what we're dealing with. And the crypto heads are all going to run for the hills on one red day with these giant, it's almost like you're sitting in your house, right? And then all of a sudden you can hear this like rumble, like, brrr. Yeah, those are giant dump trucks that say ARK Investment, BlackRock, Fidelity, right? The Sovereign Wealth Fund, the U.S. Treasury. Elon started moving his Bitcoin around today to get some attention. These guys are all coming. And actually with Elon, I'm surprised it took him this long. Elon's first move shouldn't have been to tweet bomb the orange man. It should have been just to say, you know what? I'm buying Bitcoin. I'm buying Bitcoin. I'm buying Doge. I'm accepting it for payment on Teslas. I'm going full stake and shake. Right. Why not? Why not? Particularly since, again, it is absurdly cheap. Okay. If we go to TA, one of the things that you're going to see is, okay, so Solana's higher. Solana's kind of mini top should be tomorrow, and then you would expect some sort of dip. But then again, you didn't get the dip where you were supposed to in ETH. You're actually getting it today. So you were supposed to get a dip in ETH 3 days ago. Now you're getting it now. Excellent. Right? And if there's no debacle in the Magnificent Seven stocks, you'll have this like 1 day dip and then it'll just resume. I'm still very much interested in Pepe because if ETH takes off, levered ETH should take off, which is Pepe, right? And you have this cup and handle. You had the same thing in Pengu. Right. And then also, if you think about Bitcoin, which of course everybody gave up on, which is why, I was aggressively talking to, my people about Bitcoin treasury stocks. Bitcoin treasury stocks have gotten absolutely hammered. Bitcoin goes up, puts in a pause. You could have 8 up days in Bitcoin. The biggest reason to have 8, to have down days in altcoins is that big boy could wake up. Like big boy could wake up for real. And I don't know that that's necessarily bearish the rest of the market. Right? Mike is issuing something, he's got the Wharton School of Finance working full time, creating these instruments. or he's got Wall Street investment banks do it because they make tons of money on it. And Mike is only too happy to pay. Please give me some dollars so I can buy this before it goes totally parabolic. He's just going to sit here and buy it for 6 months. First he was buying it between 80 and 110. Now the range is just going to flip. He's just going to buy it between 105 and 135. For the eventual banana zone move, whether that's in Q4 or next year. He just doesn't care. Just doesn't care. And, that people are not getting the message because they're still fighting this guy, right? The leveraged bearish strategy ETF for micro strategy. People are like, ooh, yeah. This thing went down a lot. I don't even know if I have it, right? Because everyone's like, ooh, well, I got to get short Michael Saylor stock because he's crazy. And his company is worth so much more than, the Bitcoin that it holds. Yeah, okay. Here's how much fun you've had being short MicroStrategy. Okay. Not exactly working out, right? Some people want to say it's the bigger the base, the higher in the space. I say good luck, right? Here's everyone FOMOing into this ETF to get short Michael Saylor's stock. Yeah, how'd that work out? You got nothing out of it. This ETF just bled lower. Michael Saylor's company isn't going down because nobody could ever buy the amount of Bitcoin that he has without disrupting the market. In other words, he has taken all of the selling from sovereigns, from whales, from anybody who wanted to get out. He took Bitcoin from everybody. You could never buy the amount of Bitcoin that he has without disrupting the market. You would have to have Uncle Sam or China be the seller in order to do that. And I have no idea why either of those two parties would sell. So that's why he can get away with issuing all of this paper. Like, here you go, here you go. Here's more paper backed by my Bitcoin. Now, do the optics of that to somebody who's traditionally grown up in finance, does it look kind of funny? Yeah. Yeah. It's not exactly conventional. He's borrowing money against Bitcoin to buy more Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin ever went down, the value of those securities would be in question. Mike would be fine, but the people with those securities might be, they might have an interesting experience. But, I've done some work on this, and I think the only point where you would have to worry about Bitcoin is if it went to 250 too quickly, right? If you had some Bitcoins turn around and 1x'd on the line, unless there's a macro event, right? If you just bid it up, then there's risk of a deeper correction, right? But Bitcoin's little stair step action, it doesn't get any more bullish than this. It doesn't. Especially since people underestimated it. I mean, even I did. I mean, my group thought that, it was going to hit, 120 in the fall. Instead, they just woke up and just took it to 120. The same thing with ETH and everything else. I mean, you had a pop-up Bitcoin ramp. You had a pop-up alt season. And I don't see why neither would end because of the valuation of the Magnificent Seven stocks and CryptoX rightly reporting changes in these cryptos in terms of market cap. Not in terms of price, in terms of market cap. I mean, you are going to see companies, that are valued in the trillions release earnings. And as a part of that, there could be an announcement on buying Bitcoin. If you want to have a cup of Kool-Aid, maybe Tesla is sending a signal that they're going to start buying again. Because I think they're long at I don't know, Tesla is long. I'd have to chat GBT it. I want to say Tesla is long at 40 or 60, somewhere in that zone, right? I mean, they have a nice price. They took some heat on it. But if these Magnificent Seven stocks want to get the effect of the Bitcoin treasury companies, they might start adding. And they also might get asked, analysts do Q&A with the CFOs, the chief financial officers of these companies after the earnings report. So earnings are like a spectacle in equities, right? You have the release, and then you have the conference call. The conference call is when the CFO or the CEO, most likely the CFO, gets on and answers questions from analysts and reporters. It's kind of like what the Fed does, right? They have the meeting, they release it, and then Powell does a press conference. So, I remember in 2017, after Bitcoin went up, where every single earnings conference call, the CFO had to say the word blockchain. If they didn't say Bitcoin or blockchain, the stock went down. That's how absurd that era was. And I can remember back then, the saying was blockchain, not Bitcoin, right? Which, just shows you about the absurdity of the crowd mentality. And just in case you think that this problem that they have is going away, okay? The attorney generals are meeting to discuss this scandal. That scandal is the best thing, literally. Of course, it's tragic, unfortunate. It was clearly a criminal enterprise where people were hurt and justice was not done. Leaving it there, they are going to have to pivot to crypto regularly. Because, whatever comes out of that is undoubtedly negative. They put it out there, it's negative. They censor it or put out part of it, it's negative. They don't put it out, it's negative. Nobody here, including me, was around for the Watergate scandal. It was actually a much more innocuous thing than something like this. It was a bunch of guys broke into a headquarters and stole some information, like the opposite party's campaign headquarters, right? But they just kept trying to cover it up and cover it up and cover it up. And finally, the president had to resign over it. Now, I don't think that's going to be the case here because the orange man just doesn't care unless he's in the files and he's caught red-handed. Assuming that that's not the case, they must continue to pivot towards crypto. And if you have that going on with the relative value analysis with the Magnificent Seven, any crypto could go up. Like Pengu is too cheap. Virtuals is too cheap. Arweave is too cheap, right? Because, if Solana and Ethereum are dramatically undervalued, what about things underneath the surface that actually do something? Decentralized cloud, decentralized data management. Ironically, how long before those cryptos get collected and get put in ETFs? Like Grayscale has already tried to do this. They already have a crypto AI ETF that I believe has Near and Tau in it. Don't quote me on Tau, but I think, it's led by Near because machines are not going to trade fiat, which is another interesting thing about Magnificent Seven earnings. I have something in here, I'm not bringing it up, that supposedly it was either a guy or a small group that one big Web2 company offered either somebody or some small group $1 billion to come over. So you got guys making 10 million, you got guys making 100 million, and then there was a bidding war of $1 billion allegedly for somebody, right? As they continue to FOMO in and try to win the AI race, at some point, because, Tau was doing good yesterday, at some point, this relative value analysis moves into different altcoin sectors. Also, there was news yesterday, which was, very underreported, that Aave is working with Kraken on essentially centralized DeFi, like, Aave as a portal for a centralized entity like Kraken to get interest on crypto or to just do DeFi or lending on crypto, right? Like Coinbase has a lot of plain vanilla lending against Bitcoin and Ethereum. But I mean, if you think about the sophistication of lending and finance and bond issuance in legacy versus what's going on in crypto, oh my God, the room to get more sophisticated in these areas. This, of course, says nothing about one of my personal favorite sectors, tokenization of assets. First, BlackRock wanted Bitcoin, and everybody thought it was sell the fact at $48K. $80,000 later in the Bitcoin price, people are rethinking that. BlackRock started hoovering up Ethereum around 2000, and everybody thought it was cute. Like, oh, look at BlackRock buying Ethereum. Isn't that cute? BlackRock wants tokenization of assets. And all these tokenization stocks have done nothing. All these lending stocks, all of these real world asset projects, all of these lending projects, you remember Pro for housing? Like, we could sit here and look at charts all day long. You know what the charts look like? All the way up, all the way down. And the bigger the base, the higher in the space. No one has touched any of this, which is funny because everyone's like, oh, it's alt season. It's alt season. No, it's not. No, it's not. Like 4 or 5 big cryptos went up. A couple of sectors went up, but the rest of altcoins, they just sat there. And if you start looking at altcoins versus Magnificent Seven, you have yourself a delicious recipe to grab some crypto on a red day. That's the market update for today. We will see you tomorrow.